Time-lapses are such an amazing way to compress minutes, hours, days, even seasons into seconds in a way that is just mesmerizing. There's so many things that can go wrong when shooting a time-lapse. Most of the mistakes you just can't fix later in post. That's why I put an ultimate time-lapse checklist together to help myself and of course you to think of everything before you go out and hit record. Whether you're a beginner or a pro, make sure to stick around till the end of the video while we break down all the single steps and must-knows to make your project a success. Number 1, secure a stable base for your camera. The most important thing is simply that your camera is rock solid, because in the end you don't want anything to slip or slide. The tripod should stand on a firm ground. Sand can always be a problem. If it's in sand, make sure it's deep enough. Also watch out for wind. You don't want a shaky camera, otherwise you might just skip the time lapse. What I can't recommend is these gorilla pods. They look quite nice and you can wrap it around any tree, but under stress and weight they give away and they slide, and they have ruined many of my time lapses, so I don't use them anymore, and you should drop it in the bin straight away and put your camera on a proper tripod. I hear you saying now, what should I do if I'm on vacation and I'm not carrying around a big heavy tripod? If you're just using a very light tripod because you're on vacation, you can always bring one of these portable sandbags which you can fill with sand or stones and then hang in the middle of your tripod. This will really give it a much more stable base. Number 2, always check your batteries. The most annoying thing that can happen is that you thought of everything, your camera is rock solid and you're shooting an amazing time lapse, and in the middle of your time lapse your batteries break down and you need to switch them, and while trying to do so you're probably going to move your camera and your time lapse is ruined. That's why you always should use fully charged batteries when starting a time lapse. Number 3, always check your settings. That means you should always do a test shot and have a look at the image. If your focus and sharpness sits where it should be, if your framing is the way you want it, and if not, you should tweak it and start over again. If everything sits tight, switch your autofocus to manual before you hit record. Because in the end you don't want an insect flying in front of your lens and the focus pumps around and your shot is ruined. So always switch your autofocus to manual before you start hitting record. Point number 4, lock your exposure. You should always shoot with manual settings. I mean, that can vary. If you're doing a very long time lapse and you're going into night, you might have actually a kind of a auto exposure on. But otherwise, if your time lapse is not super long and not capturing day and night, then you actually want the kind of slightly shift of brightness to darker or the other way around. That's why I recommend always shooting with a manual setting, so your exposure stays the same way and you get all these nice effects of, like, let's say a lens flare coming into your lens, or it gets darker. That's all the stuff you want with a time lapse. Point number 5, plan your interval time really carefully. The interval decides really how you compress time in your time lapse. Do you want to compress 3 hours into 30 seconds, or half an hour into 10 seconds, or even a full day into a minute? I don't know. You need to think of that before, but you also need to look at external factors, like how fast are the clouds moving? Are there waves or are there trees shaking with the wind? So here's a little tip on top. If the clouds are moving super fast, like they do sometimes in Cape Town, 1 second interval time might be enough. If there's barely any movement, you can go up to 5 to 10 seconds interval time. Number 6, adjust your shutter speed correctly. And this is really something where most time-lapse beginners go wrong, because it just feels weird to set your shutter so long. In filmmaking, there is the 180-degree rule that says if you're shooting 25 frames per second, you should use 1/50th of a second for the shutter. And if you're shooting 50 frames per second, you should use 1/100th of a second. So what does that mean for us when we're shooting time lapses? Well, so if you're using an interval time of 1 second, what should you use? Correct, half a second. But this is not a fixed rule. I've realized in some cases you might extend your shutter speed even up to the interval time. If you have something that is very close to the lens, like some moving branches or trees, then you're image might get really busy and you want this thing to be unsharp. That's why you need to extend your shutter to get even smoother shots. Point number 7, ND filters. And this is really the source of error for most beginners, that they use a too short shutter speed. And when you shoot time lapses during daytime, you always need ND filters. ND filters basically darken your lens and help you to get your exposure down. What I can't recommend are these variable ND filters, because they actually darken and give a ugly vignetting on the edge. So you just can't use them in the maximum setting. That's why I always go with these fixed ND filters. Next point, check the weather beforehand. Just make sure you have a look at your weather app and you know what's coming. When time-lapsing, you often spend hours outside, so it's never a bad idea to bring a rain jacket or something to cover your lens or your camera, because you don't want to be wet or cold. So check the weather and pack accordingly. Last point, post-production workflow. It's important to decide which time-lapse workflow you're going for. There is the workflow where you shoot everything in RAW and develop them and stitch them later together. And this workflow really offers you the biggest dynamic range in the highlights and shadows, but of course takes lots of time and a lot of data storage. But nowadays cameras are so smart, they can actually calculate a time-lapse already in the body and give you an MP4 file. And that saves you lots of time, but you need to be aware of that your dynamic range is way smaller. I've linked the entire checklist in the description below. Make sure to check all points before you go out and shoot your next time lapse. If you found this video helpful, please leave me a like and consider subscribing. More real content creation lessons are coming. I wish you happy time lapsing and see you next time.